Buenas tardes otra vez, de regreso a nuestra nuestra sesión final de conferencias magistrales de clausura. Bueno, antes de la clausura del Congreso, las conferencias magistrales de clausura, los copresidentes de esta mesa serán Susan Lieberman, vicepresidenta de Políticas Internacionales de la Wildlife Conservation Society. Welcome, Susan. Y Jorge Aranda Ortega, profesor del Centro de Derecho Ambiental de la Universidad de Chile. Bienvenidos, Jorge. Welcome, Susan. Copresidentes, la mesa es suya. Adelante, por favor.
Yeah, I'll start and then turn it over to Jorge. And thank you very much. And thank you very much in particular to the World Commission on Environmental Law, UNEP, the Supreme Court of Mexico, and all the organizers for this fascinating 2 days and for the honor to be able to co-chair this session. I'm sorry I'm speaking in English, though I did my PhD research in Costa Rica and my postdoctoral research in Mexico. My Spanish has become much too rusty. And I'm going to summarize and add a few points. We've heard from many fascinating speakers these 2 days about 3 crises facing us today: biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the pandemic health crisis. Many excellent speakers discussed the need to consider biodiversity conservation and zoonoses together. Since this is the last session, I'd like to raise and summarize some points that relate directly to the current pandemic, because it's on all of our minds. It's why we're not all together in Mexico City today. The decline of species, the degradation of ecosystems, the increased encroachment of people and commercial activities into our planet's remaining wild places, and ongoing commercial trade, marketing of wildlife for food have provided opportunities for pathogens to spill over from animals to people on a global scale. For COVID-19, scientists agree that a bat species from Southeast Asia was likely the ancestral host of what's causing this pandemic. The commercial use of wildlife for human consumption creates human-wildlife interfaces that facilitate the spillover of pathogens into people. A true One Health approach, which we've heard about earlier today and yesterday, acknowledges the inseparability of human, wildlife, and ecological health. And such an approach must be integrated with international legal solutions. A key element, I argue, must be multilateral collaboration. We've heard a lot about national solutions, but no one country, group, or sector holds enough knowledge and resources to single-handedly prevent the next pandemic. But we do know what we should have done to prevent the one we're experiencing today. Since the close of the Second World War, our planet has become increasingly interconnected. Globalization has brought tens of millions out of poverty, and that's great. But the destruction of wildlife and ecosystems and indifference to human and environmental consequences have led to our current crises. As the world recovers from COVID-19, and it will, business as usual cannot be the order of the day. We can no longer ignore our interconnectedness with the ecosystems around us for the sake of short-term economic gains. Some governments are starting to realize that we need a new paradigm, one built around One Health, a global multilateral approach to health and nature. And I argue that it's vital to look not only at national solutions, but look at the existing multilateral agreements and instruments, assess the gaps, and move forward. There have been multilateral discussions since the onset of COVID-19 that focus on public health, vaccine equity, and prevention of further spread, all extremely important. There's even a move to negotiate a new pandemic treaty under the World Health Organization. But these have forgotten prevention. And it is far more cost effective to move upstream and address pandemic prevention at the source of the pathogen spillover. There's an old line, at least in English, that says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it's just as true now as ever. We need a multilateral instrument that will help implement a One Health approach, address prevention at source, include human and animal health, and commit governments to the actions that are needed. We must all work together to prevent COVID-22, 23, 24. This Congress has discussed the future of international environmental law, and there have been fascinating presentations and the response to the biodiversity crisis. I urge you and listeners to also think about the need for an integrated multilateral approach to prevent the next pandemic in the context of biodiversity, including perhaps a new treaty, protocol, or instrument. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to Jorge to introduce our two very exciting keynote speakers. Thank you.
Bueno, concordando con Susan, ¿no? Bueno, voy a hablar en español. Concordando con Susan, claro, tenemos todo este problema de crisis de biodiversidad, ¿no? Y de las exposiciones anteriores hay un elenco de temas críticos que nos parecen paradójicos. Por una parte se hablaba sobre regulación de cuestiones ambientales, mucha regulación para quien es pequeño, pero por otra parte una insuficiente regulación para la biodiversidad. Problemas de diseño institucional para coordinar, ¿no? Avances progresivos en instituciones, valga la redundancia, pero también se ve progreso por parte del acuerdo de Escazú, ¿no? Hay una litigación climática creciente, y lo vimos con el profesor Morato Leite, pero también, por otra parte, cuidado y peligro, ¿no? Respecto de los litigantes ambientales. Para dilucidar todas estas cosas, nos acompañan dos panelistas que prácticamente no necesitan presentación, pero tengo que hacerlo y tengo este honor de integrar esta mesa. Primero nos va a acompañar Grethel Aguilar, ¿no? Directora General Adjunta de la Unión Internacional para la Conservación de la Naturaleza, quien tiene más de 25 años de experiencia en el tema, y nos va a ilustrar un poco para tratar de resolver estas paradojas y ver si encontramos soluciones a las cuestiones que nos plantea Susan. También nos acompaña el egregio profesor John Knox, profesor de Derecho Internacional de la Universidad de Wake Forest, ¿no? Quien del 2012 al 2015 se desempeñó como experto independiente de las Naciones Unidas, bien digo, y 2015 al 2018 como relator especial, y bueno, nos dejó como una gran obra de consulta obligatoria que le gustan estos temas, los principios marcos de derechos humanos y medio ambiente en Naciones Unidas. Son 16 principios que lectura obligatoria. Así que primero los dejo con Grethel, luego con el profesor John Knox, y gracias por estar. Luego las preguntas al final, en lo posible, como es poco tiempo para esta charla, trataremos de sintetizarla y realizarla si fuera el caso.
Muy buenas tardes. Quisiera iniciar agradeciendo al ministro Antonio Benjamin por la invitación a este Congreso Interamericano de Derecho Ambiental, Biodiversidad y Leyes, y a la Suprema Corte de Justicia de México por su apoyo, lamentando profundamente no estar en su bello país, rico en cultura y biodiversidad. Amigos, colegas, siendo este un Congreso regional, permítame reafirmar con emoción que el futuro del planeta pasa por América Latina y el Caribe. La región posee las más grandes y abundantes fuentes de agua dulce y cobija una inmensa riqueza en biodiversidad y cultura. El equilibrio climático de la Tierra pasa por el equilibrio de la selva amazónica y la selva maya. Somos un eje fundamental para la vida en el planeta. Y es aquí donde el derecho ambiental juega un papel determinante, regulando las conductas humanas que podrían dañar esta vasta riqueza y con ello a nosotros mismos. La región no es ajena a la crisis ambiental, en donde a nivel mundial perdemos la naturaleza a un ritmo sin precedentes en la historia de la humanidad. La reciente evaluación global de biodiversidad de IPBES enfatiza que la salud de los ecosistemas de los que dependemos nosotros y todas las demás especies se está deteriorando más rápidamente que nunca, erosionando las economías, los medios de vida, la seguridad alimentaria, la salud y la calidad de vida en todo el mundo. Es claro que un cambio completo en la forma de vida actual, un cambio transformacional es vital. Este cambio no se puede dar sin un sistema legal efectivo que vaya al ritmo y de la mano con los retos que enfrentamos. El derecho ambiental está especialmente apegado a la realidad social, económica, tecnológica y cultural en que vivimos. Y por eso es válido decir que muchos de los retos actuales en la región merecen ser vistos también desde el ángulo del derecho ambiental. El día de ayer, precisamente, la Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe, CEPAL, indicó que de acuerdo a sus estimaciones, el crecimiento económico promedio para la región para el año 2021, o sea, este año, no alcanzará para asegurar un crecimiento sostenible, ya que los impactos sociales de la crisis COVID y los problemas estructurales de la región se han agudizado. Esto quiere decir, en pocas palabras, que si no logramos una reactivación de la economía que tome en consideración la variable ambiental como uno de los ejes centrales de este nuevo desarrollo, los recursos naturales tendrán mayor presión y los conflictos sociales se incrementarán. No hay duda que durante estos días hemos escuchado grandes ideas, se ha puesto en relieve importantes sentencias emanadas de las Cortes Supremas de Justicia de la región que dibujan los logros alcanzados. También se ha discutido el alcance de las leyes nacionales en combinación con los compromisos internacionales asumidos por los países. Estoy convencida que si bien podríamos haber avanzado mucho más, hay que reconocer que ocupamos seguir positivamente impulsando sentencias contundentes, leyes efectivas y sobre todo concentrarnos en la correcta implementación de la ley, buscar la eficacia y efectiva aplicación del derecho. Retomando las palabras del profesor Nick Robinson y el juez Ricardo Lorenzetti, cuando el día de ayer hablaban de la urgente necesidad de introducir la visión legal a los grandes temas y desafíos actuales, como la lucha contra el COVID, que Susan muy bien ilustró previamente, y reconociendo esta lucha de COVID también como un nexo entre las enfermedades humanas y animales y la intrínseca y delicada relación que hace posible la vida en el planeta, o introducir esta esfera legal a los nuevos enfoques tecnológicos. Yo les quiero contar que estando en UICN, estoy dichosamente expuesta a muchos de los proyectos e ideas que se generan por parte de científicos y expertos. Y mi mente de abogada generalmente va rápidamente a cuestionar el rol del derecho en todas estas novedades, ideas, innovaciones. Por ejemplo, algunos discuten en este momento sobre eDNA, que es una tecnología que usa el DNA para conocer las especies que tenemos en diversos ecosistemas. Por ejemplo, con muestras en agua fresca se podría saber qué especies se encuentran en un determinado ecosistema. Imagínense la posibilidad de redescubrir especies que pensábamos extintas o poder tomar decisiones en tiempo sobre el manejo de especies exóticas. También instrumentos como la herramienta integrada de evaluación de la biodiversidad, conocida como IVAD, que permite que los tomadores de decisiones accedan a la información crítica integrada para informar los procesos de evaluación de riesgos y desarrollo de salvaguardas ambientales. O las discusiones en el seno del Convenio sobre Diversidad Biológica, sobre acceso y distribución de beneficios de la biodiversidad y la información de secuencia digital sobre recursos genéticos. O temas tan controversiales como el de la biología sintética con sus beneficios y riesgos potenciales. Como desde el punto de vista legal, tenemos que preguntarnos cómo, desde el punto de vista legal, vamos a poder utilizar estos instrumentos para determinar impactos ambientales con evidencia científica. ¿Qué regulaciones pueden o deben existir en estos temas? ¿Cómo vamos a prepararnos para entender con propiedad los alcances jurídicos que comienzan a discutirse con mayor profundidad? Esta es una tarea que no se puede postergar si queremos estar a la medida de los tiempos actuales. También hay temas fundamentales como la violencia de género en aspectos de conservación que pasan muchas veces desapercibidas, pero que no puede ni debe pasar desapercibida para nuestras Cortes Supremas de Justicia. Según un reciente estudio de la UICN, los delitos contra el medio ambiente aumenta la violencia de género, como se documenta ya en numerosos estudios de casos de tráfico sexual, abuso sexual y trabajo infantil en operaciones ilegales de minería, pesca y tala en todo el mundo. Es claro que es necesario ver el derecho ambiental asociado a estas realidades y favoreciendo un Estado de Derecho que busque erradicar estas conductas. La relación entre los derechos humanos y el derecho ambiental parece ser lógica y hasta inseparable. Sin duda, los retos del cambio climático, la necesidad de reconocer los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y la ingrata situación de los defensores ambientales, particularmente en nuestra región, donde contamos con varios líderes muertos por defender su derecho a un ambiente sano, ponen en relieve esta relación. Sin embargo, debemos de hacer mayores esfuerzos para que los abogados, jueces, gobiernos, sociedad estén cada vez más familiarizados con esta realidad. Sé que John Knox, nuestro próximo expositor, hablará de estos temas con la propiedad que lo caracteriza. Si bien todos abogamos por un principio de no regresión en la materia ambiental, también debemos abogar por el derecho ambiental progresivo que responda a los retos actuales. Es indispensable que el derecho ambiental sea aplicado en un contexto amplio, tomando todas las variantes sociables y donde las decisiones estén amparadas en el aplomo científico y el alcance de la equidad y la justicia. Otro tema que quisiera seguir insistiendo es la necesidad de reconocer los derechos de nuestros pueblos indígenas y en conocer cada vez más su derecho consuetudinario, derecho indígena. Mucho se ha hablado de este tema, pero pareciera que el avance es a paso de hormiga y los pueblos siguen sufriendo más que nunca los embates de un desarrollo sin límite. Quizá uno de los acuerdos más recientes que en América Latina y el Caribe podrían ser parte de este camino que tenemos que recorrer y que ha sido mencionado por varios de los expositores al indicar la necesidad de que la sociedad participe y sea una vocera efectiva demandando el cambio y siendo partícipe de sus acciones, es el denominado Acuerdo de Escazú, Acuerdo Regional sobre Acceso a la Información y la Participación Pública y el acceso a la justicia en asuntos ambientales en nuestra región, América Latina y el Caribe, que precisamente entró en vigor este año. Este acuerdo pone en relieve la necesidad de toda persona de tener acceso adecuado a la información sobre el medio ambiente de que dispongan las autoridades públicas, incluida la información sobre materiales y las actividades que encierren peligro a las comunidades, así como la oportunidad de participar en los procesos de adopción de decisiones. Indica este acuerdo el deber de proporcionar acceso efectivo a los procedimientos judiciales y administrativos, entre estos el resarcimiento de daños y recursos pertinentes. También se incluyen disposiciones sobre defensores de los derechos humanos en asuntos ambientales. Todos importantes y decisivos compromisos que ocupan, como diríamos en buen español, ocupan dientes para ponerlos en práctica y pasar de la letra a la acción. Si hablamos de un nuevo modelo de derecho ambiental, uno que sea el bastión del cambio necesario, será indispensable ahondar en este tipo de compromisos asumidos por los países y buscarles aplicabilidad concreta. El derecho ambiental es mucho más que el derecho a un ambiente sano, porque tiene impacto en nuestra propia vida, incluyendo lo económico y lo social. En este contexto, también los retos de hace 50 años, cuando se comenzó a hablar de derecho ambiental, no son los mismos que enfrentamos hoy. Y por eso es necesario ampliar nuestra visión como juristas. Permítanme terminar mencionando a los profesionales jóvenes que están sintonizando este congreso y decirles que muy probablemente ustedes estén viendo nuevos campos de acción donde debe evolucionar el derecho ambiental como parte fundamental de la construcción social. Si bien es cierto que hay mucho que aprender de los aciertos del pasado y actuales, hay mucho más por innovar y espero que ustedes tomen este reto con entusiasmo, porque sin duda puede llevarnos a un mejor futuro. En nombre del Secretariado de la Unión Internacional para la Conservación de la Naturaleza, quisiera terminar agradeciendo a Antonio, a la Comisión Mundial de Derecho Ambiental, a la Suprema Corte de Justicia de México por haber impulsado este importante congreso en un momento decisivo para el derecho ambiental y para el futuro del planeta. Muchísimas gracias.
Jorge, should I go ahead now?
Please, please.
It is an honor to speak to you today at the Second World Environmental Congress and the Inter-American Environmental Law Congress. I would especially like to thank the organizers, Antonio Benjamin, Christina Voigt, and everyone at the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, UNEP, including Ligia Naranjo and Arnold Kreilhuber, and most of all, the justices of the Supreme Court of Justice of Mexico for hosting the conference in this beautiful building. More. I've listened to many of the presentations, however, and as always, I'm impressed with the extensive knowledge and experience in the Americas on issues of human rights and the environment. For my remarks today, I'm going to focus on the connection between protection of biodiversity and protection of human rights. As we've heard, the world is facing a global crisis in biodiversity, and I believe that it's well understood that this crisis is directly connected to the global climate crisis. But it is less well understood that both of these crises are also crises of human rights. The connections between human rights and climate change have become much more widely accepted in the last decade. This morning, Professor David Hunter called attention to this development of a rights-based approach to climate change. And he emphasized that it has been coordinated across many different countries by many different organizations. When we look at the rights-based climate landscape today, for example, we see important cases being decided all around the world, from Pakistan to the Netherlands, to Colombia, to Germany, to Australia, and on and on. But remember that it took a long time to get here. The first rights-based climate case was brought by the Inuit people to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission 15 years ago. And that was the beginning of a lengthy journey. Landmarks along the way included reports by UN special rapporteurs and treaty bodies, adoption of resolutions by the Human Rights Council, and recognition in 2015 of human rights in the Paris Agreement itself. While that journey is far from over, it is clear that a rights-based approach to climate change is now firmly established and is spreading rapidly around the world. Rights-based approaches to protection of biodiversity are farther behind. They are, I think, about to take off. I hope in this decade, we will see a rights-based approach to biodiversity make a leap forward like the one that we are seeing in relation to the climate. I also believe that we have to embrace human rights and put them at the center of conservation in order to save the species and ecosystems that are now at grave risk. In my remarks, I will focus on three questions. First, what human rights obligations do states have to protect biodiversity? Second, what responsibilities do conservation organizations and other non-state actors have to respect human rights in this context? And finally, how well are they implementing these standards, and what should we do next? So, obligations of states. Under international human rights law, it is now well established that states have obligations to protect against all types of environmental harm to human rights. This is obviously the case in the many countries around the world that have recognized the human right to a healthy environment, and in a smaller but growing number of countries, including Ecuador and Bolivia, in which the law recognizes rights of nature. But more broadly, human rights courts and international tribunals, including the Inter-American Court, have made clear that environmental harm interferes with the enjoyment of a vast range of human rights, including rights to life and health. In 2018, I presented to the Human Rights Council framework principles on human rights and the environment, which tried to sum up the entire body of international human rights relating to the environment. And it made clear that the state's general duty to protect human rights from environmental harm includes a number of specific obligations, such as procedural obligations, freedom of expression and association, access to information, public participation, access to justice in the environmental context, Also, substantive obligations to adopt and enforce reasonable, effective environmental standards that are non-regressive and reflect the precautionary principle, as well as duties of non-discrimination and specific duties in relation to those most at risk. How do these obligations apply in the context of biodiversity? First, it is absolutely clear that the loss of natural ecosystems and biodiversity interferes with the full enjoyment of human rights. As the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment said in 2005 and the IPBES report confirmed 2 years ago, everyone in the world depends completely on Earth's ecosystems and the services they provide. There are countless specific examples. We depend on biodiversity for medicine, for the development of our immune systems, for pollination, and many other aspects of living healthy lives of dignity. An often overlooked aspect of our reliance on natural ecosystems is how important they are to our mental health. A 2019 study concluded that people who spend 2 or more hours a week in nature are significantly more likely to report good health and life satisfaction. Even being able to see trees from a hospital window helps you recover more quickly after surgery. Because the loss of biodiversity interferes so much with the enjoyment of human rights, states have a general obligation to protect biodiversity. But of course, some people depend much more closely on the natural environment. Many indigenous peoples and local communities around the world depend directly on particular forests, rivers, and other natural ecosystems for their material and spiritual well-being. For them, the loss of biodiversity is not just a matter of generally decreasing the store of potential medicines or decreasing the number of pollinators. Rather, the loss of the forests and rivers that are part of their ancestral homes to mining, logging, and so forth not only destroys their material subsistence, but also breaks their ties to the ancestral lands on which they depend for their spiritual lives. International human rights law recognizes this relationship in many instruments, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in many decisions by human rights bodies, including the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. To summarize very briefly a very wide and detailed body of law, it makes clear that states have duties to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples in the lands and territories that they have traditionally occupied, and also that states must only allow activities that would adversely affect those lands with the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous people concerned. What about non-indigenous people? Many people who do not self-identify as indigenous do also have close relationships with the territory that they have traditionally occupied. States have heightened obligations to protect them as well because of their status as members of minorities. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, for example, has held that states have heightened obligations equivalent to those they owe to indigenous peoples with respect to the rights of Afro-descendant tribal communities. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has interpreted the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to the same effect. Now, protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and traditional communities is critical not only to protect their human rights, but also to protect biodiversity. Much of the remaining biodiverse land in the world is occupied and used by indigenous peoples and other traditional communities. Much of this land overlaps with protected areas, but much does not. And its protection depends often solely on the efforts of the local communities. In addition, we should be clear that the knowledges and practices of the people who live in these natural ecosystems are vital to the conservation of the ecosystems. Study after study has shown that protecting their rights results in better protection for nature and biodiversity. Conversely, trying to conserve biodiversity by excluding them typically results in failure. So this is a brief sketch of the duties of states. What about private actors? Efforts are underway to draft a binding treaty on business enterprises and human rights, but it has been a slow process. However, in 2011, the Human Rights Council endorsed guiding principles on business and human rights, which clearly set out the responsibilities of business enterprises to respect human rights. In short, it requires that they avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through their own activities, and also seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, even if they haven't contributed to them directly. Obviously, this applies to the very many extractive businesses that operate in the mining and logging industries, for example. But it's important to recognize that it also applies to conservation organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund. They too have responsibilities to respect human rights in their operations. So, my third question, how well are governments and others doing at meeting human rights standards in conservation? And as I think all of you already know, the short answer is not very well at all. As a result, they are not only failing to protect human rights, they're also failing to protect biodiversity. As the Inter-American Court of Human Rights made clear as long ago as 2009 in the case of Cawas Fernandez versus Honduras, states have obligations to protect environmental defenders from harassment, not to interfere with their work, and to investigate and punish attacks on them. But just yesterday, we heard from the speakers at the panel on environmental defenders that such defenders continued to be harassed, arrested, unlawfully detained, and even killed, usually with impunity. They are under assault from the same forces destroying nature, including land grabbing, logging, mining, and poaching. When they try to protect their ways of life, they meet with violence and death. 2020 saw 229 killings of environmental defenders around the world. That's 2/3 of all of the human rights defenders that were killed last year. As we know, Latin America is particularly dangerous for environmental defenders. States are simply not doing enough to comply with their obligations under human rights law to protect them. The Escazú Agreement is an important step in the right direction, but it needs to be ratified and then implemented by countries throughout the region. But it's even worse than this makes it sound, because historically, conservation has often not only failed to protect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, but treated them as the enemy, excluding them from protected areas. Today, conservation organizations and governments say that they reject this model of exclusionary conservation, but unfortunately, there are many examples where it still persists. 2 years ago, there was a series of articles describing alleged human rights abuses in parks in Africa and South Central Asia, in parks supported by World Wildlife Fund and indirectly by many other donors. The allegations led to several investigations, including one in which I participated. In November, the panel that I was on reported that WWF had supported rangers for years, despite knowing of the alleged abuses, and that it had often failed to meet its own human rights commitments. The failure stemmed in large part from its lack of expertise in human rights, including indigenous people themselves. But WWF is far from unique. This failure to integrate human rights runs throughout international conservation. Similar investigations found that the UN Development Program and the US government also had failed to follow safeguards to ensure that conservation activities they funded did not contribute to human rights violations. This failure to protect human rights has consequences. It contributes to the failure to protect conservation, the failure to protect biodiversity. I won't repeat that. You've heard it many times over the last 2 days. We cannot afford another lost decade. Governments are currently discussing the global biodiversity framework. If it fails as badly as the Aichi targets failed in 10 more years, I'm not sure that we'll have time for another effort to try and save biodiversity. We're just too far along. We're losing species and wild animals and plants too quickly. So what should happen? The global biodiversity framework at its center right now includes this 30 by 30 target. But I want to tell you that many indigenous and rights-based organizations are very worried about that target because they believe that it will be used to justify further restrictions on their human rights. Based on the history of conservation in many places in the world, they have good reason to be worried. The global biodiversity framework in the draft now states that transformational change is needed. That's absolutely right. But for that to occur, governments have to center the rights of indigenous peoples and traditional communities throughout the framework, including the 30 by 30 target. That means that at a minimum, protected areas have to recognize and respect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including the right of free, prior, and informed consent. Park rangers must be trained to international standards. Park authorities and conservation organizations must provide for independent mechanisms that can receive complaints and then report publicly on how those complaints are being handled. And perhaps most of all, funding for conservation projects should not flow unless these standards are met, and donors should provide more support directly to indigenous peoples and traditional communities. Their own conservation organizations deserve more support than they receive. In short, to conserve nature, governments must first protect the rights of those who are on the front lines of conservation. Thank you again very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Muchas gracias por las presentaciones muy ilustrativas. Estamos viendo acá si hay alguna pregunta. Aparentemente no tenemos preguntas, pero Susan me ha dicho que quiere hacer una contribución en torno a esta brillante exposición, así que, Susan, ¿qué nos podrías agregar?
Thank you, Jorge. I'll be very brief. And first of all, thank you, Grethel and John, for your talks. Particularly Grethel, I think it is 1:30 in the morning for you in Switzerland, so we really appreciate your commitment and perseverance here. And I think both of you brought up issues relating to human rights, and I appreciate, John, that the lack of a human rights approach and the biodiversity, climate change, and pandemic crises are not unrelated. In fact, the lack of a human rights approach has driven the biodiversity crisis. The world is not infinite. And the lack of recognition of the rights of indigenous people and local communities in destruction of ecosystems and wildlife overexploitation and illegal exploitation is a human rights violation in addition to other violation. I just wanted to ask one question and raise one point, probably because I've been very involved in the global biodiversity framework discussions, that I am very sensitive and aware and sympathetic with the concerns around 30 by 30, but 30 by 30 in the discussions and in the next draft of the global biodiversity framework that is coming out on Monday is not only about protected areas, but it's about other effective conservation, area-based conservation measures, conserved areas, which in particular, I believe, need to include areas managed by indigenous peoples, local communities, and other traditional owners. So I actually think if it's done right, we can work with governments to insert a human rights-based approach into the global biodiversity framework, including 30 by 30, as long as it's not only protected areas and kick the people out, which I would never support. But I think it's important, just one final point or question, as probably the interloper here is the only one of hundreds of people who's not a lawyer, but a field biologist by training. So I work at the intersection between science and policy. How can those of us who are conservation biologists and conservation scientists, and those who are international environmental legal experts, how can we collaborate better than we have to date? I know that's a question that could be answered in several hours, but I put that out there as well. Thank you.
Well, I'll take a chance, and then, well, Grethel, why don't you go first?
Please, because it's very late.
Thank you, John. Let me reply in Spanish. So, Susan, muy interesante tu tu pregunta. Primero que nada, yo verdaderamente creo que no puede existir conservación sin estar de la mano de los derechos de las personas y en particularmente los derechos humanos. No existe un planeta en donde haya una línea divisoria exacta entre nosotros como especie humana y el resto del planeta. Así que esta alianza debe ser una alianza natural y una alianza que respetemos día a día. ¿Cómo podemos coordinar mejor? En mi presentación yo dije de lo que yo me asombro, de lo que aprendo de gente como tú, Susan, y como otros, que están metidos en la parte más científica y más, digamos, de expertos desde la parte de biología, y siempre me cuestiono cosas de cómo se van entonces a enfrentar algunos de los retos que ustedes ponen en la mesa y también de las herramientas, cómo las vamos a usar mejor desde el vínculo del derecho. Para mí uno de los aspectos más importantes es que las decisiones que se tomen desde la luz del derecho ambiental estén arraigadas en información científica. Y ahí es donde viene una cooperación importantísima en proveer información fidedigna, en tener fuentes de información que sean confiables, en que nuestros jueces puedan estar seguros de lo que están diciendo en sus sentencias es correcto. Y ahí yo creo que tenemos que crear un vínculo mucho más fuerte, así como un vínculo en poder utilizar todas estas herramientas que estaba mencionando yo antes y otras. El derecho ambiental no es un derecho solo de abogados, es un trabajo multidisciplinario. Y si no lo vemos desde ese ángulo, no vamos a poder tener éxito. Es imposible para ningún abogado el poder construir sin la mano de otras dimensiones. Llámese economía, llámese biología, llámese ingeniería. Es un trabajo multidisciplinario. Y creo que así lo debemos enfocar, así lo debemos ver y debemos de crear esos canales de colaboración más extrema.
So I agree with all of that. And Susan, I would just make two specific responses to your question. I think one thing that would help is for conservation organizations to bring in more expertise on human rights directly into the organization. One of the recommendations our panel made, for example, was that WWF should add at least one member of an indigenous community to its board. A second suggestion I would have is that the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, which was created by conservation organizations in 2009, has not been very effective. And I think that's partly because it mainly is just conservation organizations talking to one another. And I have suggested that it would be great if that was reinvigorated and that it included indigenous organizations, other rights-based organizations interested in conservation, and that it could become a kind of a regular platform for discussion of these issues in ways that would extend more broadly. I think that would help.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Jorge. We have to wrap up in 1 minute.
Yeah, bueno, simplemente agradecer la intervención de todos. Me encantaría agregar cosas, pero no hay tiempo, no tenemos tiempo. Y bueno, agradecer la intervención del profesor Knox, de Grethel, también muy buena la última pregunta, Susan, muy buena, de verdad. Bueno, pero hay que poner tiempo y dejar a todo el mundo invitado ya a la ceremonia de clausura de este evento. Y gracias a todos por su atención. Muchas gracias.